Good morning. I didn't realize I was wearing the exact same outfit that I had on in that photo. Same earrings, too. That's what happens when you give a lot of speeches. You end up wearing the same thing over and over. Anyway, thank you all for inviting me out here today. I should start my remarks by letting you know if you are hoping to get an uplifting speech, this won't be that. That's not what I do. That's for other people. Your superintendent seems like a very inspirational woman. I'm here to talk about the work that needs to be done and hopefully shame us into doing better. So, just a warning. I'm always surprised when people hear me speak and then they want to bring me somewhere because I don't feel like I'm very uplifting. So, we're going to go a bit back through time. We're going to have a bit of a history lesson this morning, and then we're going to talk about how that history ties us to the legacy that we're still trying to undo and the work ahead. I always start with history because I think in America, we don't study history very well at all. We're very dismissive of history, but when it comes to the history of race and how the history of race in this country impacts everything that we're dealing with today, I think we have virtual amnesia. We have either never been taught this history or we have chosen to forget or ignore it. So we're going to go back. My editors always laugh that I always want to go back to slavery, and I do. So if we begin with the notion of public schools in this country, it was that we believed, Horace Mann, who's considered the father of the American public school, that education beyond all other devices of human origin is the great equalizer of the conditions of men. One of the things that set our burgeoning democracy apart was the investment in common schools, saying that no matter where you came from, you didn't have to have money, you didn't have to be of a higher social class, you could go into the doors of a commonly funded public school and get a good education that could change your status in life. And this was a place where social classes were allowed to mix and learn how to become citizens in a democracy. But we know that's actually not what happened. The truth is closer to this, that from the beginning, we had two philosophies of education, one for democracy, largely reserved for white children, and one for oppression, largely reserved for black and brown children. Because even at the very beginning, when Horace Mann is trying to build up will to start this common school movement, he makes a compromise. And it's the same compromise that we will make over and over and over again in this country, and that I say we still make now, which is he excludes black children from these early common schools, understanding that if he wants to get white support for a common system of publicly funded schools, black children cannot be educated because white people will not pay for black children to be educated. So from the very beginning, we have decided that the education of black children, and then, of course, Native children and later Latino children, is not going to be as important as white children. And I would say that one cannot argue that we are still every day making that same decision. So if we understand that legacy, then we can actually have an honest conversation about whether or not our schools are broken or whether our schools are operating as designed. Thank you. So let's go back a little bit, all the way back, 1607. 1607 is the year the English landed Jamestown. 1619 is the year the first Africans are imported to what will become the United States to be enslaved. Not even 12 years after the English land, we have decided that there will be an entire group of people who will not be citizens, who will not be treated as human, who will have a status in and of themselves, who will be treated as property, who will have no legal rights in what will become this country. It would take us another 140 years before we decide to become a country. And I wonder, in this room of educators, how many of you have read Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence? Okay, that's all right. No one ever raises their hand. And if you do, I might ask you what it said. Just kidding. So the original Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson actually talks about the institution of slavery. He castigates the King of England for introducing slavery and bondage into the New World, into what will become the United States, and it is one of the slights that he lays out in the Declaration of Independence. But the Declaration of Independence that you can go visit in Philadelphia right now does not include that clause, because in order to get enough signers to the Declaration, he has to remove any mention of slavery. As you know, 5 of the 8 first founding fathers owned other human beings. And so they had to make that compromise, even as we decide we want to become what we call the most freest democracy in the world. And of course, Thomas Jefferson would go on to own hundreds of people through his entire life, including his own children. It would take another nearly 100 years before we end the institution of slavery in the United States in 1865, in the bloodiest war in the history of this country, in which we're still fighting about whether it was actually about slavery or not. Just in case you don't know, it was. And then that would be followed by another 100 years of legal apartheid in this country, where Black Americans were denied full citizenship rights in everything from voting to education to whether they could use public accommodations, to where they could live. There was virtually no part of American life that was not touched by legal apartheid, denying Black Americans full citizenship rights in the country of their birth, in the country of their grandparents' birth, in the country of their great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. In fact, many of you, your ancestors could have moved here at any time before 1968 and immediately had more rights than Black Americans who had been here for generations. Then 1976 is what I consider to be one of the greatest moments in American history. I was born. Hair's kind of the same. Now, I mention this, some history teachers in here might dispute that this was one of the great moments in American history, but this is my presentation, so I can say that. I mention that to say I'm 42 years old. It was only 12 years before I was born, where it was legal to deny Black people the right to move where they wanted to move. My father was born in Jim Crow, Mississippi, in 1945 with no legal rights that, as the Supreme Court said, a white man must respect. This is not ancient history. Really, a decade before I was born, it was illegal for me to exist in half of the states in this country because my mother is white and my father is Black, and it was illegal for my parents to marry a decade before I was born. A decade before I was born, it was legal to prevent Black people from voting. It was legal to deny Black people access to the libraries that their own tax dollars were paying for the public pools and public parks that their tax dollars were paying for. I'm not a young woman, but I'm certainly not an old woman. And I think it is necessary for us to understand how recent this history was before we decide that we need to get over it and walk away. The history of the vast majority of our country has been denying Black people full citizenship in their country. I am of the first generation in the history of the United States who has had full legal rights in this country. When you understand that, everything else makes sense. Everything else that we're battling against makes sense. It's not about good intentions or bad intentions. It's not about, the racism being whether you're in the Klan or not. It's about a history of a country that said Black people were not worthy of the same thing that white Americans were worthy of, not even legally until 40 years ago. So that's why I think it's important to go back to slavery. Black Americans, who were not considered Americans at that time because they weren't citizens, were the only group of people in the history of this country who were legally denied the right to read. They were denied access to literacy, punishable up to death if another Black person was caught teaching another Black person to read. Why is that? Because there's an understanding that literacy and education is empowering, that you cannot subjugate a people who has access to knowledge, who can think about their circumstance and who can challenge their circumstance. And so in order to keep Black people enslaved, this country decided to keep Black people illiterate. And as I've gone back researching for my book and I've looked at the slave narrative, I kept seeing this sentiment coming up over and over again, that of all the brutality, and we're talking about the intense violence of slavery that Black people faced, the thing that bothered Black people the most was being denied access to an education, that was a thing that was unforgivable. Because while we have come to think of public schools as a commodity, how can I get an education so I can make a lot of money, or get my child into Harvard, Black people have always understood that education means freedom. That if you cannot be a literate, educated member of your society, you cannot exercise your rights in a democracy. And so we have to ask ourselves, why were Black people, even back in slavery, risking death, being mutilated for teaching each other to read and for wanting to learn to read? Yet we have this very insidious stereotype that Black people are the only group of people in the United States who don't value an education. You all have heard this. Whether you believe it openly or not, you have all heard that somehow Black Americans don't value education like other people do. And I say the history and the record shows that that's not true. and it also just doesn't make sense. Who does not value an education? So of course, we have about 120 years of public education operated under the system of legal apartheid. And then in 1954, we have what's considered one of the greatest rulings the Supreme Court ever made, which is Brown v. Board of Education. Though apparently some of the new justices being considered for the courts don't necessarily agree with that, which is an amazing time to be in, if amazing means terrible. So the Supreme Court in 1954 makes this very radical ruling, and I think we don't understand how radical it was because most of us have never lived in America where this ruling did not exist. Overnight, the Supreme Court overturns decades of legal apartheid and says you can no longer separate black children from white children in schools. It seems like common sense to us now, but that turned the world on its head because everyone understood that when the court rules on that in schools, it also will be ruling on that eventually in every aspect of American life. The way it's commonly told is the court rules, and then all the white people who wanted segregation for the last 200 years realize the errors of their ways, and everyone holds hands and sings Kumbaya, and then we go into an integrated future together. But that's clearly not what actually happened. The South loses its mind. The white South loses its mind. It says that this ruling is an illegitimate ruling. It launches into massive resistance, and 10 years after the Supreme Court says that legal segregation in schools must end, most southern states have not desegregated a single school. It's not until the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that the federal government begins to sue school districts for not complying with Brown v. Board of Education, and you begin to see desegregation happening as the Supreme Court, which had done very little to force integration after it struck down Brown v. Board, begins to rule that integration doesn't mean just removing laws from the books that say segregation is legal. You actually have to move bodies and get black and white kids in schools together. And in parts of the West, of course, this extends later to Latino students as well. So you have basically no integration for 10 years, and then when the courts begin to force and the executive branch begins to enforce, very rapidly in the South, the dominoes fall. And by the 1970s, you go from complete apartheid to 90% of black children in the South attending integrated schools. So that whole notion about we tried integration and it didn't work, where it was forced, it actually did work. But of course, outside of the South, including places like Nevada, including places like New York, where I live, and in the Midwest, white communities didn't believe that Brown v. Board applied to them at all. They were very happy when they thought Brown v. Board was only about making the South behave, though the North and the West was just as segregated for black children and to a lesser degree for Latino children as the South. So I like to go back and show some photos so we can remember how ugly this fight for integration was, because I think we've kind of blurred that part out. So this is Ruby Bridges wearing those cute little bobby socks in that very grown attaché case. Ruby Bridges was 6 years old in this picture, and those gentlemen who are flanking her are the U.S. Marshals who had to walk her past the angry white mob every day so that she could become the first black child in the South to integrate a white elementary school. She received death threats, her parents received death threats, and actually every white parent pulled their child out of her class, and she spent the first semester of her kindergarten year in a classroom with just her teacher. Her teacher heroically taught that child, but she was isolated by herself. And I think about my own child who's 8 years old, and one, would I have had the courage to subject my child to that to try to make a better life for other children? But two, what kind of people yell and threaten a 6-year-old child? And the truth is, the kind of people are many of the people who we know in our own lives. They were regular folks. This picture here on the right is a brown baby doll that they put in a casket that they made that they would parade in front of Ruby Bridges as she was attempting to enter the school, to tell her that this would be her fate if they were able to get past law enforcement and get their hands on her. I think it's important to look at these pictures and look at the women, because I hear all the time in Trump's America people talking about what white men do, Often these efforts were led by mothers. And we know that when it comes to education, it is often mothers who are making the decisions, and it has often been the history that it was white mothers who were fighting desegregation and lining up outside schools to block black children from going into schools that their parents paid taxes for. This is Boston, because we often think about the racist South. Boston had one of the bloodiest battles for school desegregation in the country. This is right before this man tries to impale this black man on this flag for attempting to protest segregation in schools. This is one of the Little Rock Nine, who once she got into the schools, the taunting didn't end. Most of those children did not finish out that school year at that school. Of course, the National Guard, who's having to be brought in to protect children from entering schools. These pictures are from all over the country, from no particular region. So it's good to just sit with that history for a second and realize those pictures are in black and white. All of those pictures, nearly all of them, except for the Little Rock, are from the mid to late 60s. Again, many of your generation, definitely your parents' generation. This is not ancient history. These bloody battles to simply allow black children into schools with white children is very, very recent. And as you can tell from your own state, from this timeline, it goes on well into the 1970s and 1980s. I've written about school districts who are still fighting desegregation as late as the 1990s. There are currently districts all over this country that are still under orders to desegregate because they have never fully complied. This is not ancient history. Your own state initially tried to bar black children from receiving an education altogether. So not simply saying you can't go to school with white kids, but saying you shall not be educated at all. These are tax-paying citizens of the state. The Supreme Court in Nevada rules that you cannot bar black children from schools, but you can segregate them. And then again, as late as 1970s, you have the Clark County schools and other school districts fighting against desegregating their schools, nearly 2 decades after the Supreme Court rules segregation is unconstitutional. So why does segregation matter? We know why it matters, because segregation deprives black and brown children of resources, period. During the time of rapid desegregation, this chart is NAEP reading scores. You saw a rapid closing of the racial achievement gap. Between 1970 and 1988, which is the peak of desegregation in this country, the achievement gap in both math and reading is cut by half. 1988, when we start to see resegregation occurring, you see that gap widening. And you can think of every reform as educators that we have now gone through: No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, big schools, charter schools, small schools, specialized schools. All of these various reforms, none of them have managed to close the achievement gap to the place that actually allowing black and Latino and white children into the same school buildings and the same classes, because I'm clearly not talking about integrated buildings with segregated classes, which is often the way that we do as well. Nothing has closed the achievement gap like school integration. But by 1988, really just 2 decades after we really started getting serious about school desegregation, we decided that we had done enough. That after 250 years of legal segregation, 2 decades of actually trying to do something about it was enough, and we start to go backwards. The Supreme Court starts to rule to make it easier for school districts to be relieved of their school desegregation orders. Ronald Reagan comes in on a platform of halting school desegregation and believing that we just will make separate schools equal, which we have been promising to do for 200 years. And so you see on this chart, the percentage of black children in majority white schools peaks in 1988, and now black children are as segregated as they were in 1972. We've literally moved back in time. And despite the fact that black children have never been really more than 15% of the population of the United States, there's never been a single day where even half of black kids attended a majority white school. And now, Latinos, which for most of the country were a relatively small population until the last 20 years, and so we're fairly integrated, except in this part of the country where, of course, the population has been much larger and they faced segregation. Latino children are now as segregated as black children, and often it's Latino and black children segregated together in the same buildings away from white and Asian students. And I apologize for not including slides on Native Americans. I don't usually give speeches in school districts with a lot of Native students, but you could look from the charts that your superintendent showed that black and Latino students, or excuse me, black and Native students do the worst on almost every indicator, and it is not accidental that the two groups who did not choose to be here are the two groups who suffer the worst. So how many of you have ever actually read Brown v. Board of Education? All right, who wants to recite that ruling? Just kidding. Most people haven't, though I think educators should probably have read the most important ruling for your profession and for the history of our country. But I think it matters that we haven't read that ruling, therefore most Americans actually don't know what it says. Most Americans think the Brown v. Board of Education is about unequal resources, that is about the achievement gap. Brown v. Board doesn't mention the achievement gap or test scores, not one time. And Brown v. Board of Education doesn't talk about resources except to say that even if resources are the same, is segregation still unconstitutional? And the court says we believe that it is. What it says is that separate is inherently unequal, that in a country founded on racial caste, where black children were separated to be deprived of resources and because we believe they were inferior, that to keep black children in separate schools means that you will be depriving them of their full citizenship, and you cannot make that circumstance equal. If you understand that Brown says segregation cannot be made equal, then this whole argument that today we're not going to work on integration, we're just going to make black schools equitable, then you see the fallacy of that. But most of us have never read the ruling, and we have all walked away from that. Largely as a country, we have decided that we're not going to try to integrate schools anymore, that it's too difficult, and that we keep promising we'll just treat those black and Latino schools the same. How many of you have seen a black and Latino school that you felt got the same resources as a white wealthy school, public school? Raise your hand if you've seen it. That's just sad. I haven't either, and I've studied national data all across the country, and I can't find a single place. And every time I give a speech, I challenge people, if you're this community where black and Latino segregated schools get the same resources as white schools, please tell me and prove me wrong. And nobody has ever been able to do that. And what does that say about us? Somehow, we've told ourselves that this picture on the left, which is 1953, was wrong. And we all agree that that was wrong. And we're very proud of ourselves for deciding that was wrong. But somehow the picture on the right, we've decided is okay, because we don't require this by law anymore. Though my work shows that though it's not required by law, segregation is still a matter of public policy. It is a matter of choices that policymakers make every day and individual people make every day, and it is intentional. The picture on the left is the Bronx, New York. The picture on the right is Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This is not a problem of a particular region of the country. It is not a problem of backwards, racist Trump supporters. It is a problem of America. And in every community where you find significant numbers of black and Latino students, you will find classrooms and entire schools, and sometimes entire districts that look just like this. There's nothing in and of itself bad about an all-black learning environment, except for what I just asked you, was have you ever seen one that got the same things? And then you understand why integration is necessary, because it ties the fate of the children whom we value with those who we struggle to value. The research shows that segregation harms learning for children, for black children. The longer a black child stays in a segregated school, the wider the achievement gap grows. So even if those kids are coming in with a gap, instead of closing that gap, these schools are actually widening it. They come in a few years behind, and by the time black children graduate, if they graduate, they have fallen 5 to 6 years behind. Andrew Young once said, violence is promising someone 12 years of education but only giving them 6. That's what we're doing for a lot of our children. And of course, your own county, though the black population is not large, has tremendous disparities between black and white students in graduation and academic achievement. And it would seem in a district where your black population is so small, this would not be a difficult problem to solve if one really wanted to solve it. And I understand a lot of children come in with gaps, but frankly, if you don't believe you can educate children, why are you educators? If you don't believe that a child can walk in the door of a school and you can help that child transform his or her life, maybe this wasn't the right profession. Because the truth is, you can look at all the data that the U.S. Department of Education keeps, and we have not made separate but equal a reality for a single day in this country. To this day, you can judge what type of school that school is, what resources it has, by the color of the skin of the kids in that building. Across the board. It's not saying that there aren't any white schools that don't struggle, but if there's a black school nearby, it always has less of everything. But much more than academic achievement, because I think, and I know educators know this, when all we talk about are test scores, we're not talking about what education is really supposed to do. Test scores are a simple measure of certain things. But we believe in education because we believe education can change your life. We invested in public education in this country because we believe that where you start is not where you have to be. But instead, we are creating schools that keep poor children, and particularly black and Latino children, wherever they started. Our schools are educating them to remain where they are. Integration matters because it actually has been shown through longitudinal studies to change the entire trajectories of black children's lives. It's not just about can they score high on a standardized test. What it shows is that it actually makes black children are less likely to be poor if they've gone to an integrated school. They're more likely to graduate from high school. They're more likely to go to college. They're less likely to engage in criminal activity. So we're not just maintaining schools that don't allow kids to get good test scores. We're maintaining schools that ensure that the racial caste system that we founded this country on will always exist, because we're depriving children, particularly black children, of the quality education that we demand for our own children. And then we know teachers often experience segregation too. When you look at where are your black and brown teachers, they're almost always in segregated, high-poverty black and brown schools. When you look at where are your black and brown administrators, they are almost always in segregated, high-poverty schools. Now, often, that's because these teachers and administrators went into the profession to help those types of students. But that also means that those teachers and administrators are going to spend their entire career in schools that are labeled as failing, in schools that are under-resourced, and in schools that don't get respected. So we are also segregating our teaching staff away from opportunity. The unintended consequence of Brown v. Board has been the loss of black educators. Within 10 years of school desegregation, there was a loss of 45,000 black educators, and we've never recovered. And of course, now our teaching staffs across the country are not reflective of the students who we teach. We have a country where nearly half of public school children are children of color, but just 13% of teachers are black and Latino. Why does that matter? Because there has been tons of research on the implicit bias that black and Latino children face from educators. Now, I don't believe that anyone goes into education because they want to discriminate against children or because they don't believe that children can learn. But when you think back on the history that I just told you, we have a country that has embedded in the DNA that black people are inferior, that black people don't value an education, that black people cannot learn at the same as white people, that black people are intellectually inferior. And no matter how well-intentioned you are, to think that none of that seeps into your interactions with your students, I think is very naive. And what the data shows is that starting as early as preschool, white teachers are already believing that black children cannot achieve as high as other children. They are more likely to doubt the abilities and capabilities of black children. And it is very important because black children in particular are extremely susceptible to racial bias from teachers. Racial bias from teachers can really change that student's will and ability to learn in the classroom. So then it becomes self-fulfilling. You already don't think this child cares as much about school or his family cares enough about school. I can't tell you how many times I hear from white educators who tell me their parents just don't value school or education. I would never let a teacher teach my child who says that about any parent, because I don't know a single parent who doesn't think education is important, even if it doesn't manifest in the way that we think it should manifest. So I can't read this because it's super small. But this was a poem that was recently posted by a Baltimore City public school student. As you know, Baltimore City schools are extremely impoverished, extremely segregated. You may have saw the pictures this winter of kids having to sit in classrooms with coats because they didn't have heat in their schools. And it makes me think, this is what segregation does. It concentrates all of these students who have these tremendous disadvantages in every aspect of their life, and then we put them in a school and disadvantage them there too. All of you as educators know, it's one thing when you have 5 students in your classroom who come from deep poverty, who come from very chaotic, dysfunctional neighborhoods. It's quite something else when 90% of your students come from that environment. How much time can you spend on an individual student trying to catch that student up? How much time can you spend finding out, as this poem said, that your kid didn't come to school with a pencil because he was at home by himself the night before, because he was taking care of his siblings, because he was sleeping on a friend's couch? That becomes impossible in schools where nearly every kid has this story. This is another reason why integration matters. It is more manageable. You can actually help those students when it's not every child. I also like this poem, though, because, I don't know, can you guys read it? Okay. Because I think it gets to, again, I'm not an educator. I just spend a lot of time in classrooms and observing students, but I also then spend a lot of time outside of the classroom with those same students. And you understand how, as you all know, so much about their home environment affects how they interact with you in school. And then it's often read as these kids are unmotivated, these kids don't care. We don't understand their lives. And we should not have schools where every single kid is experiencing that and they don't have a chance to interact in any other environment except a school that is as dysfunctional as their neighborhoods. We can't do a lot. Let me change that. We could do a great deal about the poverty that our kids come from if we chose. But most housing is in private hands, and we clearly don't have a government that's going to fund broad anti-poverty campaigns. But public schools are supposed to be that place where if everything else in your life is shit, you can come into the doors of a school and be treated with respect and dignity and get an education that can allow you to see something different for yourself. Our children need you to show them that, to believe that just because, little Johnny comes in without a pencil doesn't mean that he doesn't want to learn. He needs you more than the kid who has everything. So I hope that you guys can think more about that, and I'm very honored to be here as you guys begin to engage in this equity work, because I know, a lot of people don't want to hear that they're doing things wrong or be chastised for the work that they do. I cherish educators. I believe in public education. I am a strong advocate of public education. But we have to do right by our kids, and we aren't always doing that. Because I think the truth is, you can't have both of these things. And we've been trying to work around the edges because segregation is easy. You don't have to worry about upsetting powerful people who don't want their kids in school with those poor kids. You don't have to worry about dividing up resources where, like my daughter's school, we can raise $2,000 in a good year on our PTA, but a mile away, they can raise $700,000 in a good year. Segregation is easy, except for the kids who have to deal with it. So when you look at No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, when you look at every school reform, it's all trying to get at that one thing. How do we bring black and brown achievement up to the level of white? But we won't talk about the one thing that has only been shown to work on scale. And if we refuse to talk about the one thing that we know works, then what are we doing? Because I hear a lot of excuses why we can't integrate our schools. Politically, it's too challenging. How would you make it happen? Busing. Let me just let y'all in on a secret on busing. Kids rode buses for 100 years before they ever rode a bus for integration, and nobody cared. As a matter of fact, Linda Brown, the lead plaintiff in Brown v. Board of Education, sued for the right to go to her neighborhood school because she was being bused away from her neighborhood school to a black school further away. So we only cared about busing as a tool of equity. We don't care about busing in general, FYI. So you hear all of these excuses, but one of the things that you never hear about integration is that it's not what's best for children. And in truth, the research shows it's not just what's best for Black and Latino children and Asian children, it's best for white children. That it helps white children to become greater thinkers. Because you think about it, when you're in an environment where everyone thinks like you, your thinking is not challenged. You solve problems in diverse groups because people come at the problems at different angles. It teaches children about the real world. We have a country that is changing, and we have children who are being isolated and can't deal with those changes. And then the much more important thing to me is we can't say we want equal educational opportunities and then all of us as educators fight to make sure that our own children get every advantage. Because those two things are actually at odds with each other. You can't have equality and advantage at the same time. And I know that this is where the rubber hits the road. I'm a parent. I know that this is the hardest thing, that it's easy to have values in the abstract, and it's quite something else to live those values. When you ask anyone, do they believe in equality and integration, most people will say yes. When you ask them where they send their own children to school, their schools are often not reflective of that. And I know that this is the hardest thing. For most of my career, I wrote about school segregation. I did not have a child, and I did not have a child in school. And it was very easy for me to look down on the choices of other people when I didn't have to make a decision in very unequal public school systems about where I would send my own child to school. And I remember I would be interviewing activists and academics and educators who were all working and saying that segregation was wrong, and then you'd ask them where their own children went to school, and none of their children went to the schools that they wrote about. And I knew even then that I did not want to be that type of person. That if I'm saying that these children are not deserving of less than my own child, how can I keep my child away from them? Then I moved to New York City, which is one of the most segregated school districts in the country, an extremely unequal school district. When I moved there, my daughter was 1, and every middle-class person I ran into was already asking me, what are you going to do about schools? You can't put your child in your neighborhood school. I live in a low-income Black neighborhood. And so this piece was about my decision that I had to argue and fight with my husband about to enroll our daughter in a 95% poverty, 93% Black and Latino school in the city. And we decided to do that because I believe that segregation and inequality is systemic, but it's also upheld every day by our individual choices. And you can't say it's wrong, but then take a choice and make a choice that sustains the system. And in truth, I don't think my daughter is worth more than other kids because I have more money. I don't think if you believe in public schools that there should be great public schools for some, okay public schools for others, and terrible public schools for the rest. It's one thing, we're in a capitalist country. I do judge people in private school, but I'm not talking about kids in private school. But in a capitalist country, you get what you pay for. If you can afford private school, then buy the best private school your money can buy. But if you are in a publicly funded school, we should not have the disparities between schools that we allow. And we always know which kids are going to be in those unequal schools. So I did this story about choosing to put my daughter in a segregated school. And I got some pushback from parents who asked me, how dare you sacrifice your child for an experiment? How dare you do that to your child? I thought that was the most disgusting thing, because all I did was put my child in a school with other children who had less than her. And my child is doing great. I get this question all the time. And I'm like, my daughter was not Ruby Bridges, right? So people who are like, oh my God, is your child okay? Did she survive? Of course she did. There were no mobs waiting outside to beat my child if she went into school. It is not a sacrifice for my child to be in school with other black kids like her. This is her on the left at her art show that they had this year. It was very cute. They had little cheese trays, and we couldn't have wine, unfortunately, but... And this is the picture on the right is every birthday she wants to bring donuts to school. So there she is in her class bringing donuts. And if you look way in the back, you'll see a little white boy. And his name is Sam, and he's my daughter's best friend. And he lives right behind us, and his parents also, for no political reasons, said we live in the neighborhood and we're going to send our child to the neighborhood school. He's been, for the last 3 years, the only white child in that class. And all of the people who are so concerned about Sam, he's doing great because he's a kid in a school with other kids. But what has been really great for my daughter has a lot of privilege. I'm a New York Times reporter. We travel, we go to museums. She's very sadly spoiled, trying to work on that. But she also learned that every kid doesn't live like her. And she sits in the classroom with kids. I had to teach her that Santa Claus didn't exist because she came back after Christmas and wanted to know why Santa didn't come to little Andre's house. And she asked me, was it because he was bad? And so that's when I bring my daughter into the real world, and I tell her, no, everyone, there is no Santa. Mommy's been Santa all these years. Finally glad to get the credit for it. But that every kid doesn't live like you. And that those kids aren't less than you, and they don't add any less to the classroom than you. They may add something different. They may not come in reading at the level that she's reading in, but the discussions they have together, the things that they teach each other has been amazing for my daughter. So it's not just that our presence is benefiting the school, which is the way we often think about integration, but it is that my daughter and our lives are being enriched as well. Because all of these children whom we write off, they have so much to offer, and we are really missing out. And the bigger question is, when everyone's asking me how dare I sacrifice my child, it's whose children then are we willing to sacrifice? Whose children are not worthy of all the things that we demand for our own children? When you have every advantage like my daughter has, even if the school, and trust me, the school is not great all the time. There are certainly things where I know if I were in a wealthier school, things that wouldn't happen or things that would. Because if integration was great or segregation was great all the time, it wouldn't be a problem. So I didn't expect that would happen. But I can give my child anything that she doesn't get in that school, I can make up for her. For her classmates, a good education is the only advantage that their parents might be able to give them. And we want to deprive those children of that one advantage too. So I always end my talks by asking us to look at some of those kids who we've decided are worth the sacrifice. Many of you have probably seen some of them in your own classrooms, in your own community. And I want us to understand that we choose to sacrifice them. We say every kid deserves the same thing, but not those kids. We're kind of okay with it. Their lives are bad anyway. We don't really expect them to compete with our own children. So we don't really give them access to the tools to compete with our own children. So are these the kids that we sacrifice? These are children in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that I wrote about a few years ago. Tuscaloosa was forced to desegregate by the courts. It did not fully comply until 1988. Y'all can do the math on how many years after Brown that was. It complied for approximately 16 years, then its desegregation order was dismissed by the judge, and the way the law works, as soon as your desegregation order is closed out, you can do anything you want to resegregate schools as long as you don't explicitly say you did it for racial reasons. So these kids are in a 99% black school and a 98% free and reduced lunch school that is perpetually being threatened with closure. You guys know how this goes. Every 3 years, it's getting its administration replaced, it's getting its teachers replaced, because we're constantly punishing both teachers and kids for their poverty while rewarding schools that should be doing well because every kid is middle class. So do we sacrifice them? Or do we sacrifice Maria, I interviewed and I met Maria when I did a story after Michael Brown was killed on his school district. It's a story I did for This American Life. And I wrote about Michael Brown School District because when the riot started after Michael Brown was killed in Normandy or in Ferguson, I was thinking about schools. And I was thinking about schools because if you remember the footage, his mother is standing in front of the police tape. Her son's body, her oldest child, is lying on the ground behind her. He's lying there dead. And she says, "You know how hard it is to get a black boy to graduate?" And I'm thinking to myself as a parent, if my child is lying on the ground dead behind me, it seems like the last thing that would be on my mind is school. Unless you understand how much of a struggle just getting something most of us take for granted was for that child, that family, and all of the black people in that community. And I knew at that moment if I went on Google, and it took 5 minutes to confirm what I thought to be true, I knew he went to a segregated, high-poverty black school. I knew he went to an under-resourced school. And I knew that that's why his mom said that while her son was on the ground dead behind her. In fact, out of 517 school districts in the state of Missouri, Michael Brown's school district was 517th in terms of academic achievement. It was the poorest, most segregated school district in the state, and it got so bad that the school district, the state actually stripped its accreditation. So when he graduated with that diploma, it was a worthless diploma because it was from an unaccredited school district and an unaccredited high school. And if you remember, the story was that he was going on to college. He was actually going on to a predatory for-profit trade school that was sanctioned by the Obama administration because that's the only type of college a kid from a district like that can get into, even though he did his part. So I wrote this story about Maria, who, because of the district unaccrediting the state unaccrediting the district, it actually triggered this little-known law that allowed all the kids in the unaccredited district to go to a neighboring accredited district, and that district had to take them. Well, if you understand race in America, you know the complexion of the kids in the accredited district. So this law accidentally gave integration to those kids. It allowed them to go to a nearby white district, and that nearby white district raised holy hell. The town hall meetings that they had to try to deny those kids access to those schools sounded like 1956. In the end, the state decided it finally had to do something about the bad education in Normandy. So what it did was change the name of the school district, change the law, and force those kids to go back to their segregated schools. So I wrote about Maria, who was a top student, who all she wanted was a good education, all her mom wanted was a good education, and she finally got access to these schools and to see what a real education looked like, only to be forced back to her segregated schools that hadn't changed at all. So was she the kid that we sacrificed? Because integration is too hard, because equity is too hard? Or is it Delisha? I always end on Delisha because this big dimpled girl stole my heart the moment I met her. The moment I met her, I knew I was going to write about her. If she wasn't a black girl with a name like Delisha, we'd call her an all-American girl. But we never call black girls with names like Delisha all-American girls. This is the night she was crowned the homecoming queen. She dated the football star. She was a state track champion. She was on the mayor's youth council. She was an honors student. She did everything that we tell kids to do if they want to be successful. But she went to an entirely segregated high-poverty school that often didn't have certified teachers in the classroom, that had no advanced placement courses, while the white high school across town had 20 advanced placement courses. It didn't have physics. It didn't have chemistry. It didn't have a yearbook. It didn't have a newspaper. And she spent 13 years in schools just like that. And when I met her her senior year, she never attended school with a single kid who wasn't black. And most of the kids were poor. She did everything. And she was very confident. And then she took her SAT. And then she took her ACT. The first time she took it, she got a 14. Second time she took it, she got a 15. And the highest she was able to get was a 16. After her third try, I asked her, "Are you going to try again?" And she said, "Why? There's no way I can learn what I need to learn in this amount of time after 13 years of school to get a score high enough to go to the University of Alabama, which was 2 blocks away. You could see the stadium from her school. She had no chance of getting in there. And she told me she had been confident her entire life because she'd always been an achiever. She'd always done everything that she was supposed to do. And when she sat in that ACT test prep with the white kids from across town, it was the first time she realized she didn't know half of what they knew. And it wasn't because she didn't care, and it wasn't because she didn't do her work. So every day she would come home, and while most other kids with all of her accolades would come home to their mailboxes brimming with letters recruiting her for college, she would come home every day to nothing. And if she was lucky, she'd have a recruitment letter from the military. Because as you know, military's bread and butter are schools like that. And for a while, she thought of going into the military because she felt like it was her best option. She ended up applying to a historically black college in Birmingham where she was accepted. She actually just graduated, very proud of her. But that's not what she wanted. And we would sit in her living room and she would tell me, I'm looking forward to college because I finally will get to go to school with kids who aren't like me. And I'll get to learn and talk about Shakespeare with Latino kids and Asian kids and white kids, and I'll get to have an experience that I never had. And instead, she spent another 4 years in a completely segregated learning environment, and it was great for her and she did well, but she did well in spite of. And that's what we're asking so many of our kids every day, to do well in spite of. We've made a promise that we aren't keeping. We've all made a promise that we aren't keeping. And it's not enough to think that you're one of the good guys, because I live in New York City, the most liberal city in the country, and it has the most segregated schools. Everyone will consider themselves good guys, but they will not put their kids in schools like with girls like Delisha. So just look at her one more time and ask yourself, whose kids are we willing to sacrifice? And my answer is, we've already made up our minds. We already sacrificed her, and we sacrificed Maria, and we sacrificed those little kids who sitting on that rug in that school. And we have to choose. Okay, this kind of messes up my little ending, but you know, you're supposed to build up. Now I feel like it's a letdown. Anyway, all I would say in the end is as you guys embark on this journey that, as your superintendent said, it's going to be uncomfortable. If this was easy, we would have done it a long time ago. It will not be easy. But we have to decide if what we did yesterday is the future we're going to have tomorrow. I hope you will all look into the eyes of the children in your community and truly believe that they deserve the same thing that you want for your own children and that every other child deserves. We should not have good schools and bad schools. We should not have advantaged schools and disadvantaged schools. You guys are on the front lines. I know your work is hard. I have seen enough schools and been in enough classrooms to know this is not easy. And I know you guys are asked to do more and more, to take on a bigger and bigger role. But I also know that you got into this because of your altruism, because you believe in this work, because you know what you do can be transformative. So as I leave, I just ask, push yourselves harder. Confront those truths that are uncomfortable. Think about, what's your tolerance level for that little black boy who doesn't act quite like you think he should act? Do you really believe that that little black girl can go into that AP class and compete? Or do you funnel her into the classes for kids like her? And even more than that, what are you doing with your own children? And how are the decisions that you make about your own children either upholding the system or dismantling it? Because the last thing I'll leave you with, which won't be on a positive note, because I never leave on a positive note, is if you wouldn't enroll your own kids in the school you teach in, I think you need to do a lot of thinking about what that means. Thank you all for the work you do and for listening so attentively.